I'd like to call to order the Regional Railroad Authority. Roll call, please.
Carter.
Here.
Huffman. Metis Castillo.
Here.
McDonough.
Here.
McGuire.
Here.
Reinhardt.
Here.
Ortega.
Aye. Entertain a motion on the agenda, May 7th.
So moved. Second.
Hearing no discussion, roll call.
Metis Castillo.
Yes.
McDonough.
Here.
McGuire.
Aye.
McGuire.
Aye.
Reinhardt.
Aye.
Carter.
Yes.
Ortega.
Aye. Entertain a motion on the minutes from February 26th.
Move approval.
Second.
Hearing no discussion, roll call.
Metis Castillo.
Yes.
McDonough.
Aye.
McGuire.
Aye.
Reinhardt.
Aye.
Carter.
Yes.
Ortega.
Aye. Today we have just one agenda item, which isn't we don't need to vote. It's for information and discussion. So it'll be an update on the review corridor, but also to give the public an idea of where we're heading as a board with the review corridor. Mike, you want to come forward?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Commissioners. Mike Rogers with the Public Works Department here, Transit Project Manager, and the Project Manager on the Riverview Corridor since 2014, and just wanted to give you an update on where we're at today since it's been a while since we've been before the board with anything related to Riverview. So Riverview, as you know, last year the board approved the locally preferred alternative, so I want to give an update on where that's at in the whole time frame, where it's at related to the 2040 Transportation Policy Plan, what we've done with tribal coordination since the last time we've talked, where we're at with Federal Transit Administration coordination, as well as talk about some of the existing contracts we already have underway on the corridor that you entered into last year as a board, and then talk about next steps going forward for the remainder of this year. So, as you know, the Riverview Corridor, this is just kind of a quick background piece. Locally preferred alternative is modern streetcar, generally along Highway 5, West 7th Street, from Union Depot, connecting to the airport, to the Mall of America, as well as the neighborhoods in between. It's going to have roughly 20 stations, cost about $2 billion to build, have about 20,000 daily riders in 2040 once it's up and running. As a corridor, it's different from other rail corridors that have been built in this region in that for modern streetcar, it's looking at running in both dedicated guideway and shared use. So for the dedicated corridor, it'd be very similar to things that we've already seen with light rail where you're not allowed to drive on the tracks. But for where it's in shared use, that would be a place where the tracks are level within the street, cars can ride over the tracks, buses can be on the tracks, trucks can be on the tracks along with the streetcar. So it's making a different use of the right-of-way, allowing more uses to be there due to constraints and wanting to have a better fit within the environment that's there. We also know that as we implement this corridor, we have to make sure it is compatible with the existing rail services that are operated because it's going to use Green Line tracks in downtown St. Paul and use Blue Line tracks once you cross the river into Hennepin County. We also need to make sure that the stations that are out there are very high amenity. So we need to make sure there's level boarding, that there's off-board fare collections, that we have the shelters, the heating elements. So it's a significant investment out there just because a streetcar tends to be a little bit smaller than light rail doesn't mean you have less amenities. It's just a better sizing for the ridership out there as well as fitting into the characteristics of the corridor. So a lot of people are asking, what is modern streetcar? People tend to think about the New Orleans systems, that's more of the heritage fleet, or they think about buses that run around and call themselves trolleys because they tend to think, oh, or they'll go back to what was here in the region 50 years ago and go, well, is this that? No, it's not. It's a different spin on some of those same services. It takes some of the best parts of those older services and modernizes them to mix them with some of the things we like about light rail as well. So the first systems that tended to do this were the Seattle and Portland. And those vehicles are significantly shorter than a light rail vehicle. They're also narrower. So you tend to have 3 seats wide instead of 4 seats wide like we have on our light rail vehicles. As modern streetcars have evolved, they've started to increase in length and become wider just like light rail vehicles. So if you look at the Atlanta streetcar, that is a Siemens vehicle. It's exactly the same as what we have as our light rail vehicles on Green Line, except they're shorter. They're about 10 feet shorter, but they're the same width. In Detroit, what you'll notice if you look closely at this picture, there's no overhead wire on that picture. So a significant piece of the Detroit corridor is off wire. So they run the vehicles on battery power. Those are the things we will need to look at for Riverview to make sure we do a great job of fitting this in around things that are culturally sensitive or crossing rivers, those sorts of things. Where can we make the best use of what technologies that are out there to make this corridor fit in even better? So as we As we and others along the corridor approved the locally preferred alternative, it ultimately went to the Metropolitan Council for adoption into the region's 2040 Transportation Policy Plan. They opened public comment back in November, closed it in late January. The council had 800 people engaged, got 80 comments. Excuse me, a lot of the comments focused on, is this the right mode? Should it be bus? Should it actually be light rail? How much is this going to cost? What was the process for selecting it? What's the process for how the project moves forward? What types of environmental impact are out there? Ultimately, the council did take the Riverview Corridor and amended it into the Transportation Policy Plan at the end of February. So that's a great step for the project. It now means the corridor is part of the regional system. It plays into the larger system as other corridors like Gold Line and Rush Line go forward as well. One thing that came out of that engagement was a specific focus on tribes and to say, okay, we know we're crossing the Mississippi River next to the Minnesota, the confluence there. That's the historic Fort Snelling, but it's also Bedote for the tribes, and particularly the Dakota, that has a lot of significance to them. There are state and federal laws that really require us to be coordinated and consult with the tribes, and we're trying to do more than what is just required by the letter of the law to engage them early and often. So within Minnesota, there are 11 federally recognized tribes. Really, the northern part of the state is the Anishinaabe reservations, and then the southern part of the state is the Dakota communities. So when we reached out with the Met Council to say, would you like to get an update on Riverview to talk to you about what this corridor is, what potential impacts there could be, the 4 Dakota tribes were the ones who responded back and said, yes, we would like to talk to you. So we met with the 4 Dakota tribes, we met with the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council, and the Minnesota Historical Society's Native America group as well to say, this is what the corridor is. Do you have any comments? We want to keep you engaged in this project. And what we heard is that they were very appreciative of us coming out to them early. A lot of times the tribes get engaged after significant engineering has been done, and it's much harder to change what the corridor is or where it's going based on their input. Or worse than that, they get engaged once something's hit during construction. And that's really not what we want on this project. So we went to them early. We want to keep going to them. They are really going to be the lead for how we engage them, how often we're with them, how their staff is involved, what we're saying to them and how. What we heard back from all 4 was we want to be engaged with individually. We don't want to be grouped into a committee that talks about everything as if we're one group of people. We are individual nations. We want to be treated as such, and that makes complete sense. They also expressed an interest in having their technical staff serve in our committee structure so they could be from the bottom up, influence everything all the way through, understand the project more thoroughly as to why decisions were being made in such a way, as well as be able to influence things early on. So that was a good first step on the tribal side. We've then been...
Excuse me, Mike.
Do you want me to ask a question now, or should
Yeah,
I wait
go
till
for
the
it.
end? My question is is with the tribes. I've just heard a few concerns, and I'm so grateful that you're engaging them and everything. And so when we say a locally preferred alternative, it means that we've already surveyed and asked people about that. And so is that when we reach the alternative, is that a predominance of the people there or just a majority? And were the tribes involved in any of those conversations? Or maybe that's to come. So maybe you could just explain a little bit more about when you say LPA.
Yeah.
You know, when you say locally preferred alternative, were they already engaged in any of that?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner McGuire, the tribes, we sent information to them ahead of the locally preferred alternative. We never heard anything back. It wasn't until this most recent round where we started to get the state involved where we got more response. Our locally preferred alternative at this point is a line on a map saying this is the mode we want and this is the general alignment. As we go into the engineering work and environmental work, that's when we're going to dig deeper to say this is where a station should be. This is exactly where the track should be in the street. This is how we should cross the river, whether we use the existing bridge or put a new bridge up. How do we go through the tunnel at Fort Snelling? Those areas are clear where we need to have tribal input at Fort Snelling. That one's an obvious one to us. When we met with the Prairie Island Indian community, they also pointed out that they had settlements up by the Schmidt Brewery that I did not know of, that was very interested in. They said, we are willing to share our cultural information with you so that you can get more information out there to have a better set of data and analysis for making your decision. So the decision has been made in general where we want for a locally preferred alternative. Now the details have to come out of how that gets mixed in, and the tribes are going to be part of figuring out the detailed piece of this to find out what's the best spot to put this to avoid impacts, not just to them, but to others as well, and how to make it culturally sensitive as well as fit in with the community.
Thank you.
All right. So on the FTA side of the world, last year we submitted in May a class of action request to the Federal Transit Administration. And what the class of action request is it's asking them to confirm what type of environmental document we need to do on the project. We know we're going to be an environmental impact statement. We're just looking for the FTA to say, yep, that's exactly what you are. We're a big project, a very complex project, so that falls under an environmental impact statement. During the time that we submitted this, the FTA was also reviewing Executive Order 13807, and that's kind of thrown a monkey wrench into the process and the timeline out of FTA. That executive order deals with environmental streamlining and also has a goal of getting you through the environmental process in 2 years. And when we've talked to people about a full-blown EIS, there's really no way that you can start an EIS and then get done with it in 2 years, doing it the traditional approach, which is your draft environmental impact statement, your data gathering. And in this region, we then complete the draft environmental impact statement, hand it off to the Met Council. They complete the final environmental impact statement onto the record of decision. A lot of words, it takes roughly 5 years. So as we've talked to people at the FTA, as we've talked to staff at the Met Council locally, we've talked to consultant staff, the way you can make this work is to try and take that data analysis that you would typically do after you gave notice that, hey, we're going to do an environmental document, you pull it forward. And you spend your 3 years up front of getting all your data ready, so it allows you to streamline we're actually doing the document to we're done with the document at the back end. So you're not changing the amount of work you're doing, you're changing when you're doing the work based on your formal notices. And then the final
That's a
thing.
new definition of streamlining.
And then the final thing that we're working on here is, besides the FTA saying they will be the lead on the federal contact with the tribes at a nation-to-nation level, doesn't mean we can't keep talking to them, but from the federal side, they will be the official coordinator there, is that they don't know exactly if this executive order is going to apply to Riverview. The executive order is flexible in that it requires 3 different things before it can be applied to a project. One is that you have to be an environmental impact statement, which Riverview will. 2, that you have to have more than 1 permit from the federal government to build the project, which Riverview will. And the 3rd is that you have to have reasonable availability of funding. And because we don't have formula funding coming to the project, we're in competitive grant solicitation, where we don't know if we're going to ultimately get funding. That's where it's kind of, we don't know, we're not sure, we haven't gotten a determination. So instead of just sitting here on our hands waiting for the feds to come up with a decision of whether or not this applies or not, we've tried to work with people to say, what can we do? And again, it comes back to that, let's do that technical analysis ahead of doing the official notice on the environmental document. So let's get through all of our range of alternatives. Let's do our engineering to our 15, 30% work so we can really get good answers. We'll know what those historic impacts are, what those cultural impacts are, as well as where these stations will be, where the track's going to be. Let's figure out how we can set up our schedules to streamline the back end of this, and let's continue to have public engagement on the project. So there's still a lot of work to be done that we can do for the project.
Excuse me, May.
And I want to ask, thank you, I want to ask all of the detail of this question, because clearly you just outlined a number of things which typically happen in a process which now are compressed and have to happen within an extremely escalated period of time. You're, taking note that we are able to accomplish some data analysis ahead of time, whereas in the process, you're typically figuring out what the data analysis should be. So accomplishing it ahead of time introduces some concerns as well. So there are just a number of things that we have little time potentially, if this executive order applies, to accomplish, and it requires a slowdown at the front in order to explain that potential to our communities and to ensure that early engagement that has to happen ahead and now has to happen in tandem if the executive order applies. So I'm just wanting to slow down, express that concern right now, and recognize the difficulty that we all are going to have as we work through this process together. Also to ask the question with respect to our doing even more than what the federal government requires with our interaction and engagement of Native American nations, you know. So how we do that ahead of time while they are going to be the lead and make sure that we get the information and the interaction that we need introduces some great complexity. I want to recognize that, and any response that you might have, you know, besides what's just been said, we're in touch with them. They're going to determine how they want to be engaged. They're also going to understand all these complexities and compressions of activities. Is there anything
I think the biggest thing, Mr. Chair, Commissioner, on the tribal side, and really in general on the communication, is to build those relationships with people so that it doesn't feel like I only get to talk to you once a month or once every couple of months. It's, I can pick up the phone, I can have a meeting with you, I can shoot you an email and get the answer that I need right away. I think that's what it has to come down to. And yeah, we're kind of switching the process up, which will take some education on people, but we're not trying to reduce the amount of public engagement we're going to do. We're going to try and do more than we've done in the past because we know how important it is. So it's doing things out of order from the past, but it's not trying to get rid of steps.
No, I really appreciate your attention to that because it isn't just compressed. It is out of order and you know, potentially can be of high impact to our ability to successfully do this work. So thank you so much for your attention.
Victoria?
But what I'm hearing is that it truly isn't compressed. It is the same amount of work done in a different order. And the way we do our work, obviously, is as open and as transparent and as much public engagement with everyone as we can possibly have. And it's going to be interesting to see, and I do think that that's an important delineation, is that it is not less work or less time. It's just the order you're doing it in, correct?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner, I think you're correct there. I think it's compressed on the federal side because they're not necessarily carrying what you do until you get into the formal environmental piece. So they're saying instead of you're going to have a 4-year environmental window, you're compressed to 2. You just had to do all your work in front of it, which we're not going to pay as much attention to.
So
And
yes
do
and
they fund that then?
No.
But in the old process, they did, correct? Isn't that part
As
of?
long as you were in project development, they would.
Okay, so now we've got the real crux of the issue. It's changing the timeline so that more of the cost comes to the locals. Okay. But regardless, we're going to do all of the work and make sure that we have that community engagement. So regardless of what order it goes in, we're going to get a quality product.
Yes.
In the end. And I think also the fact that we are already kind of in the process may weigh in on this as well, because it's hard to be partway into the the process that we are using right now, and then to try to switch it up is more difficult. And that happens in other things too. Whenever something changes, if you're in the middle of it, they generally will let you finish it, but we're kind of at the beginning of the middle. So, we'll figure it out, but it's still going to take the same amount of time, and we are going to take our time to do it right, just as we always have.
Okay, so along those lines with trying to wonder where we are exactly, what's going on, we as a board, or you as a board, not we, because I'm not part of the board, but you as a board have approved 2 contracts to keep work going on Riverview. And they both were approved last year. The first one was work with MnDOT Cultural Resources, and that was to help figure out a Phase 1A, which is kind of the nitty-gritty of what's really historic out there, what's really architecturally significant, how do we take 10,000 plus properties that could be eligible and narrow it down to something that really is eligible or could be eligible. It tries to take a look at a quick literature search of what's out there, does a preliminary survey of structures to see if a building may be built 100 years ago, but somebody put an addition on it 20 years ago that totally wrecked the historic character, so therefore it's not really an eligible property anymore. It also looks at historic context. So you may have 600 homes that were all built of a certain type of stone. Well, great. But maybe in 10 of those homes, somebody important lived in them at some point in their life. Those are the ones that are going to have more context than the other homes. So those are the ones that are, relatively speaking, going to be more important than the others in the corridor. We also did work with Martinez Geospatial, knowing that doing survey work on this corridor is very important to do the engineering and to understand where the environmental impacts could be. We started that last year. They've just wrapped up all their data gathering, so now they're into the processing of that data. We have new aerials on the corridor. We've got all the survey work done, and we're going to end up with basically a package at the end of the day we can hand off to the consultant that ultimately gets awarded the engineering piece for this and say, look, you've got this all done. That's going to save that consultant 6 to 12 months of work. So we've been doing stuff behind the scenes to keep things moving while still trying to figure out what the FTA is going to direct us to do. But both of these contracts will be done by the end of this year. So as we continue to move forward, we're going to continue to work with the FTA on whether or not this executive order applies to us. We're going to continue to work with the tribes on engagement. We're going to work to finalize the work scopes of the Riverview pre-environmental works project. So we have 4 contracts right now that we're thinking about that, and we're breaking these up mainly because we want to try and increase competition, allow as many firms to bid as possible, as well as be able to select the best firm for individual tasks. So things like engineering and pre-environmental are very well supported by certain firms. They're very good at those things. Communications is a different set of firms that for this type of a contract, it'd be better, we think, to go out and get a specific communications firm instead of trying to bundle them within an engineering contract. Same for stationary planning. And then a project management consultant is something to help us out as staff to make sure that all these other consultants are doing things that we don't have exact expertise in. The one thing that isn't showing up here because it's a more recent discussion is whether or not cultural resources needs to be pulled out as a specific contract on its own. And the general prevailing feeling here is that it should be, because that will help us get even better engagement with the tribes. They could help us by sitting on the selection committees and reviewing proposals as well. So we think that these contracts are going to be released sometime this summer and then awarded this fall so that we could start work really late this year and rolling into the next year, and that would take roughly 3 years to complete these contracts. So here's just a better visual of that. Again, 3 years to get through this work. So that's what I have for a presentation. If there's any other questions, be happy to take them.
Any other questions of Mike? Great job, Mike. Thank you for your good work. Corridor updates, Victoria?
Well, we have a number. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Oh,
I should have had the list.
To put you on the spot.
I was like, whoa, okay, right here. We are doing a number of drop-in discussions about stations for Rush Line. There have been the task force itself and the policy advisory committee met a couple of weeks ago and are moving forward. We have all of the station locations now, have gone through the process, and now are moving into the environmental assessment stage. So that's where we really dig into what's going to happen, how will it look, what can we do to mitigate traffic concerns or environmental concerns specifically. And every station, there's 21 stations on the Rush Line. And I think it's important to note that, some of them get more attention than others, but the reality is we have to make sure that on any of the stations that we do, just as we did on Central Corridor Green, the Green Line now, is what fits best. How can we make sure that if there are parking issues that are there, that we need to mitigate that, we need to work with again, the community engagement is key. We need to work with everybody to say, what is the concern? How can we address it? Is there something that needs to change in what we're doing, and being really open-minded about listening to what people are saying. I think that it is exciting, some of the workshops that we've had, and now some of the just drop in and discuss different stations in different locations, and they're was one last night, and I think there's also, I know there's one on Thursday evening as well. And so it's going to, for people to get the actual listing of what's going on and when, because it would be impossible for me to remember all that right now. And honestly, all you have to do is go to the website. There's also an opportunity on all of our website, the information that we're doing on our projects, for continued community input and questions and trying to move forward with things. But we're in a good spot right now and moving forward.
Great. Any?
So this is not necessarily a county project, it is a MnDOT project, but it's the 35W Min Pass Lane, and it definitely affects county roads and all of our people. So we're beginning to hear from everyone who's sitting in traffic now already with the closing of different lanes now as they're getting ready to, adjust the road to have a min pass lane. So our public works people have been great in really working with our communities to get alternate routes for some of the traffic, and we continue to work with that. So the people are concerned. Traffic is not good out on 35W North between Minneapolis through Roseville all up to Blaine, but we're going to be dealing with that for a while now. But just thanks to our public works for trying to help our communities, deal with that, and also just provide those alternate routes for that work.
Thank you. Any other?
Can I just want to say one thing about Min Pass lanes as we're talking about this with folks. When you think about the amount of time that the Min Pass lanes are actually for Min Pass.
Oh, right.
Sometimes people forget that. They think, oh, well, that's only if you can afford to go in that. It's like 4 hours a day in each for 35E. That's what I have the most experience with. And the rest of the time, it's open for all traffic. And so it is a benefit to everyone. And sometimes people forget that. They think it's just, that's it, it's dedicated. So I just wanted to mention
Thank you
that
for
as you're
that
going through the
reminder.
process.
Yeah. Thank you for that reminder as we go through all this traffic that we're coming to a good place.
Hearing no further discussion, we're adjourned.